All right, we might get started. Today we're going to talk about regulation and risk, and begin with looking at how errors happen in organisations. I think, we've all said at some point everyone makes mistakes, and how do organisations respond to that very true assumption, and try to get the best results nonetheless. We're going to look particularly at the systemic nature of risk, that it's part and parcel of everything we do. As was just pointed out to me, my football team is going to debut somebody who's never played a game of AFL on Sunday in the biggest game of the year. It's absolutely a risk. And there's a whole range of things they don't know about him that will happen in that new environment that he's not been exposed to before. But I think they've taken all elements into account, well I hope they have, and decided that of all the choices they could make, this one was the one with the biggest chance of success and the least risk of failure. I'll hope that that's the case. We're also going to look at Perot's notion of normal accident theory, and it's an interesting look at the way if you set up systems that are incredibly complex, that it's almost setting up a system that will contain risks and inevitably at some points fail, and what organisational responses there should be to that. And then we look at both internal and external regulation of risk and error. In what context do organisations have to think about the way risks are regulated externally? Because of course it's not all about what the organisation wants. They live in a society and they're responsible in some level to the people who live in that society with them. And we'll look at different modes of regulation and legal standards, and then from that some critical issues in assessing how we regulate risk and harm. All right, here's a little diagram. I hope it's useful to you. The red circle is the kind of the more unknown area of exploring say an innovation that you're intending to make, and in designing the goals that you have for that innovation, that you're essentially designing what risks are acceptable to you if they're known and what aren't. And also in terms of implementation and controlling, there are some more known things that where you already know that you have some roles to play, and I'll explain that a little bit. Oh, I didn't realise I'd set that in train. So the whole notion of setting a goal is inherently something where you should think about risk as well, because risks are formed at the very early stage of any project. Whatever decision you make, play the new player, play the old player, there's going to be risks involved. That red oval talks about creating new things, and invariably involves a range of decisions that some areas you're really not sure, you're going into uncharted waters, so you have a fair degree of discretion about what you might choose because it's a new area, but you also have a range of elements like lower information content. Was that mine? Anyway, the specificity of your knowledge is not necessarily strong because it's a new area, and you're maybe not able to verify what you know and its applicability in some elements. So you don't know what you don't know sometimes when you're moving into a new area. And so in that environment, you're going to have wider sources of variability in the elements of the decision that you make and how they're going to work together. So a greater level of contingency in the decisions that you make. And so therefore innovation is almost always going to create risk. It wouldn't be innovative if it wasn't new, and therefore elements of unknown about it. So if you think of a new drug or a new technology that you want to trial, there's a whole range of strategic decisions you need to make in that process, rules that you might need to abide by, and routines that maybe have already been established by some other innovation that you made in the past, which may or may not be applicable. So if I use the example of a new drug, there might be choices that you make about funding the research required, who you're going to get to do the research, designing protocols around it, whether to proceed with certain trials, will you make the choice to go into production, and what routine controls might you adopt from past practices. All those decisions involve some risk. And as I said, that green oval in the table is about those things that are more likely to be known, that you have to slot the new bits into in some ways. So decision parameters that might be around things like standard operating procedures or rules and regulations that apply in the particular industry that you're in. So again, if we use the drug trial drug trial example, there's a thing about, choosing participants who might undergo the drug trial, and there are all sorts of established procedures and ethical guidelines already established for that kind of process. But if error does happen, how are we going to analyse it? And there's a lot of work in this area. I think foremost amongst the academics who've looked at human error is a guy called James Reason, and it'd be hard to think of an industry who hasn't taken Reason's work and applied it to engineering, nursing. He comes from the aircraft maintenance area, maintenance and design, but it can really be applied to a whole range of other industries. So he looks at, where are the acts that are determined to be unsafe, and they're divided into two types: the ones we intend to do, and the others that are unintended actions. And I'm sure these all come up in your daily life as well as in the industries that you might work in. In terms of slips, lapses and mistakes, they're those unintended things that seem to creep into a lot of things we do. So things like someone might intrude, email buzzers going when you're working. How many people sort of look up the minute the ding goes on their computer that an email's arrived, and they check that rather than what they're actually doing? Oh, I must be the only one who's got the attention span of a gnat then, because I think it's one of the things that people, if they want to fully concentrate on what they're doing, they should turn that off, because it does intrude. And of course you might stop, answer that email. When you come back, you have to take a little bit of time to work out where you were at when you left. And in that process, you might think you've done something and omit doing it. You might reverse the order of doing something in a way that's unsafe. You might have several things that you've got on the plate and you do them in the wrong order. Maybe you do something that's less urgent rather than something more. Or you might mistime what you do it in the morning when it should have been done in the evening. If I think of, say, nursing, you can think of many ways in which that might happen to a nurse. She's trying to give medication. Oh, I said she, isn't that terrible? The nurse is trying to give medication to a patient. The patient in the next bed might throw up, and she's got to go and deal with that. And in the meantime, she comes back and she forgets that she hasn't given a particular pill, or she's marked it off and meant to do it and then doesn't realise she hadn't. She might give the medication in the wrong order, or miss time, you know, give a morning medication in the night time, or vice versa. In terms of memory failures, quite often I'm a classic for thinking about, oh yeah, I really need to do that. And if I think about it enough, I almost convince myself I have done it. And then someone says, oh, you still haven't, you know, sent me that email or something like that. And I've realised that I've thought I've done it, but I haven't. When you get you lose your place in something, then you might misremember to do something, or you might forget your intentions to do something. You know, an email again is a classic one of that. You see an email, you think, oh yes, I'll do that, and then more emails come in and you just forget that you've undertaken to do something. Then in terms of rule-based mistakes, you might misapply a good rule, do the wrong thing, even though it's the right thing to do, or you might apply a bad rule. A lot of people seem to work on gut instinct. I think gut instinct is a bad rule in some environments, but people apply it. And then, of course, there are many, many knowledge-based mistakes. And I should say we've moved into the area of intended actions now, things that we do deliberately. We might not be intending that a bad thing will happen, but we do them knowing that we're perhaps moving from procedure or something like that. A lot of people might make knowledge-based mistakes. They have knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily apply particularly to the situation that they're looking at, and they mistakenly apply the learning from one area to another. They might make a routine violation where they aircraft maintenance engineers will often admit that they do something that's not in the manual, but it's just they know a quicker way to do it. And most of the time that's not a problem. It's just something, the manual's not very accurate in the best way to do something, but sometimes it can mean that they apply that in a way on a particular plane that causes a problem. Then there are exceptional violations, people who are very skilled at their job but under pressure might just make a mistake in that one particular time. And then there are deliberate acts of sabotage, you know, somebody who's upset with the company who does something against procedure because they're cranky and they want revenge. In terms of errors and risk, I think, you know, human beings are incredibly skilled, and I think that's more and more so given the number of things that young people have to come across, even, you know, just to the age you are. I think the skills that you have are far greater than the skills I had at the same age. But when we look at why people make mistakes when they're incredibly skilled, I think we start to see ways that certainly we can learn from those errors and try not to make them again. And that's where James Reason came into this research. He was inspired by the 3 Mile Island disaster. Does that ring any bells? It's a nuclear meltdown in the US. The operators were unable to diagnose quickly enough what was going on. There was basically these systems that went wrong very quickly, and the meltdown happened without them being able to adjust and work out what to do. And in the end, it was determined that there was some control room instrumentation that was faulty, but also that the operators hadn't received sufficient training to be able to react quickly enough to know what to do. And think about that when you're watching the film next week, if you come to watch film's gone out of my head. No, anyway, when you see it, absolutely that question comes up in that film. Deepwater Horizon. I knew it had come to me. And Reason's got an interesting research method. He's given diaries to people and asked them to record when they make mistakes and what they're doing at the time and why they think they made those mistakes, so he can start to identify pattern causes of people making errors. And I found this little film. It's a little bit naff and old, but it explains it really well. So I thought I'd show, I won't show the whole thing, I'll just show half of it. But it gives you an idea of the things that he's thinking about.
Lydia knows that practice makes perfect. Practice is how you acquire a skill. To the outsider, a skill like this can appear magical. The fingers dazzle. They seem to have a life of their own. And yet, every day, our own fingers perform equally amazing routines, like making tea, that demand the same degree of coordination. We take it for granted. It's second nature. Everything we do is interwoven with hard-earned skills, and yet we still make mistakes. After all, we're only human. We're fallible. But does our skill help to prevent error, or help to cause it? Could it be that practice makes us imperfect? Tenerife, 1977. The world's worst air crash. 2 jumbo jets collide in fog. The verdict, human error. The headlines are tragically familiar. Always that same curious phrase, human error. Is it something remote from everyday life? Must disasters on such a terrible scale have equally awesome causes? Does a pilot make some special kind of error that we don't? In one sense, yes. The mistakes are different. If we were suddenly thrown untrained into a cockpit, we'd crash. We aren't pilots. We'd touch the wrong controls just as Lydia hits the wrong notes. This is the simplest, obvious kind of error. Lack of know-how, lack of skill. In pilots, it's thankfully somewhat rare. It's when a pilot uses all that bravura skill that his mistakes in the cockpit are like ours in the kitchen. Take, as a case in point, the unconscious computer program we run in our heads when we want a cup of tea.
Go to the tap and fill the kettle. Plug it in. Switch it on. Go to the cupboard and get the tea. Fill the pot. Get the saucers. Get the cups. Go to the fridge and get the milk. Pour the milk. Pour the tea.
Why tea making? Professor Jim Reason, psychologist, Manchester University.
Well, it's an interesting business tea making because it's remarkably productive of error, and this is, I think, for a variety of reasons. It's something which is very automatic and we do it daily, and it's something we couldn't really bear to keep our minds on even if we tried. It's also something which is episodic. One thing finishes, another thing has to follow it. We have to wait for these things to happen in sequence. And also it's something which we can't always tell visually where we are should our minds be elsewhere, and we can make a whole range of different kinds of errors, and some of them I'm sure you recognize.
Errors of tea making. 1. Omit key action. Prepare kettle but forget to switch on. 2. Select wrong program. Put coffee in teapot. 3. Lose place in program. Jump ahead. Pour water too soon. 4. Lose place in program. Repeat action already accomplished. Fill pot twice. 5. Forget intention. What have we come for? 6. Correct intention. Wrong object.
Now, the interesting thing about these errors is that they are not random or bizarre. We don't, for example, find ourselves blowing raspberries down the teapot. The errors we make are all part of the normal repertoire of skilled behavior, and it is because the behavior is so skilled that these particular kinds of errors occur.
When we're still learning a new skill, we monitor what our hands are doing very closely. At this stage, hands and brain operate a kind of closed feedback loop, carrying out actions, checking for errors, feeding back corrections, trying again. This is the learning mode, and it demands our full concentration. But the more the brain becomes programmed by the repetition, the more we can relax our vigilance.
With increasing practice, what happens is that one's control of action becomes more and more open loop. That's to say, we give it more and more to an autopilot or to some lower center of control that doesn't seem to involve conscious attention.
This conjures on autopilot the virtuoso mode. Simply switch on and forget it. The action program runs the hands and cards. The conscious mind can drift off elsewhere. Trouble is, once you've reached this stage, there's no going back.
And in fact, with a highly skilled activity, if you do attend too closely, then you actually disrupt the smooth flow of activity. If you're running downstairs and suddenly ask yourself, what are your feet doing? You're going to trip up and fall down the stairs. One of the problems, however, with this delegation of control is that these lower centers that we give the control away to seem to acquire an autonomy of their own, so that once in a while they take our actions along a direction that we didn't intend them to go, simply because they're so recently and frequently used.
Every time we use an action program, we strengthen its connections in the brain and weaken others. The way we always drive home is a strong route. Detours are not.
Must pick up Lydia from the station. Must pick up Lydia from the station.
If we normally go past the station turnoff and only rarely go down it, the chances are that the stronger route will win, especially if we're preoccupied.
The first thing I must do when I get in is pay that electricity bill. It's been
The strong programs wait like hijackers. A moment's distraction and the autopilot is captured.
Go to the cupboard and get the tea. Go to the cupboard and get the tea. Go to the cupboard and get the tea. Go to the cupboard and get the coffee. Go to the cupboard and get the coffee.
The stronger coffee routine has won.
Other forms of error involve attending to something when you really should not have attended, when your mind was probably best elsewhere. For example, in the tea-making sequence, you can suddenly wake up from a daydream and ask yourself, where am I in the sequence? And you can come up with two kinds of wrong answer. You can say, I'm further along than I really am, and therefore you find yourself making an omission. Or you can say, I'm not as far along as I really am, and you can find yourself repeating an action. Other kinds of errors seem to involve something at a very low level where two action programs, or as we sometimes call them, action demons, seem to be competing for the limited control of action, and we get some kind of blend of the two.
Come in.
One of the commonest forms of mental lapse is that where we appear to be attending to something but are not actually taking it in. I think all of us know the example where we've apparently followed the words on a page with our eyes, but at the end of the page we can't recall anything.
So what happened then? You didn't. Oh, you didn't.
Blunders in the kitchen cost nothing more than a little spilt milk. But can maddeningly trivial errors like these really cause major disasters? March 1977. On the small airstrip at Tenerife in the Canaries, two jumbo jets collide. The facts are simple. In thick fog, a KLM jet taxis onto the runway, followed by a Pan American plane. KLM is to turn at the end of the runway and wait there for takeoff. Meanwhile, Pan Am is to leave by the third exit and come up behind KLM. The first error. Pan Am misses the exit. He's still on the runway. The second error. KLM has not received takeoff clearance, but without warning, he suddenly takes off. At Tenerife, it's the kind of day that breeds errors. Thick fog, congested airport, only one radio channel, only one runway, overworked controllers, tired pilots. It's been a long day. 2 minutes to 5. KLM leaves the terminal and taxis onto the runway. 4 minutes later, it's Pan Am's turn. The American captain calls up the tower.
Tenerife, Clipper 1736.
Clipper 1736, Tenerife.
We're instructed to contact you and alter the taxi down the runway, is that correct?
Affirmative. Taxi to runway and leave the runway third. Third to your left.
Third to the left, okay?
I think he said first.
I'll ask him again. Would you confirm that you want the Clipper 1736 to turn left at the third intersection?
The third one, sir.
The airport's unfamiliar and the visibility is poor. The Pan Am crew find their way with a small map.
Haven't seen any yet.
I haven't either. There's one.
There's one.
Exit C1, the first taxiway.
That's the 90 degree.
Okay.
That's 2.
Yeah, that's that 45 there.
Yeah.
That's this one right here.
Yeah, I know.
Exit C2, Pan Am heads for C3. Meanwhile, over a mile away, KLM is turning. KLM is now lined up for takeoff. Pan Am approaches C3.
Next one's almost a 45, huh? Yeah.
But it goes back. Yeah, but it goes ahead, I think. It's going to put us on the taxiway.
Maybe he counts these as 3.
They're confused. They've just realized that C3 slopes backwards. A Boeing Jumbo is too wide to make this maneuver. Can this be the right exit? At this precise point, KLM calls the tower for its departure routing.
The KLM 4805 is now ready for takeoff, and we are waiting for our ATC clearance. The KLM 8705, you are cleared to depart.
The Pan Am crew listen to this exchange intently. Their own departure routing will be the same. They concentrate. The first error. The plane slips past C3.
No, I mean, this factor of preoccupation does keep cropping up in all kinds of errors, and it isn't altogether dissimilar from the kind of error that we might make, say, in the kitchen, when we're intently listening to a phone conversation. We intend to pour just the normal amount of milk. We find ourselves, because we're so preoccupied, pouring the cup full.
Poor visibility, uncertain plan, concentration on the radio. Pan Am have made the first error. It's 5 3/4 minutes past 5 at Tenerife. KLM are still requesting their departure routing.
The KLM 4805 is now ready for takeoff, and we are waiting for our ATC clearance. The KLM 8705.
The controller gives the ATC clearance, the route information, but includes the words,
Right turn after takeoff.
as we'll see, the phrase may have triggered off a strongly familiar action routine in the KLM captain's head.
Yeah, well, we go. Check first.
The second error. He decides to roll. The plane gathers speed. The co-pilot hurriedly confirms the clearance.
Roger, sir. We are cleared to the purple beacon flight, level 90, right turn now, 040.
He ends with the words,
We are now taking off.
At this point, fate compounds the two errors. The tower can't see either plane, but hears KLM say,
We are now taking off.
and assume he means at takeoff position. The tower replies.
Okay. Stand by for takeoff. I will call you.
But Pan Am, on the same channel, also hear KLM's message and jump in with their own warning.
We are now taking off. Okay.
And we're still taxiing down the runway. The Clipper 1736.
But the two warnings overlap and cancel each other. KLM hears neither.
We are now taking off. Okay.
Clipper 1736.
And in fact, the OK seems to confirm their decision. Disaster is now inevitable.
There he is. Look at it. The goddamn bastard is coming.
Get off! Get off! Get off!
Why would an experienced pilot like the KLM captain take off without clearance? Analysts have pointed to all the short-term factors that increase the chances of error, the fog, the single channel and so on, and also to the captain's worry about exceeding his duty hours.
But there is another long-term factor which is possible, and that is something that the American Airline Pilots Association called the training syndrome. That is the fact that the KLM captain was the KLM's senior training instructor, and in the past 6 years had spent something like 15,000 hours training other pilots in the simulator. Now, in the simulator, general practice is for the instructor to give the clearances as if they were the air traffic control, and to give the airways clearance and the takeoff clearance as one and the same. So, it is possible that under this particular stress, the KLM captain might have reverted to this familiar habit, as we indeed do, that we have a tendency to fall back on well-established routines.
Those routines are always waiting their chance. The coffee routine is more familiar than the tea. We're distracted. Coffee takes over. We're caught. Is this powerful influence avoidable? In specific cases, yes. It's now agreed that training captains should spend less time in simulators, that words like takeoff disappear from ATC clearances. We learn something from Tenerife, as from every disaster. But are accidents still just the luck of the draw? Or are there factors that make our natural error tendencies worse? The more we interact with complex technology, the more we need to know about the interaction. Are there some people who have more accidents than others? And if so, can we avoid them? The Applied Psychology Unit of the Medical Research Council has...
I might stop it there because it's going to go into areas that we don't need to go. But I think that really is a great example of the way that different errors can arise, and the importance of setting up, if we know that these things happen all the time and they happen from the simplest task to the most complex, the KLM captain couldn't have been more experienced and yet still made fundamental errors. And you can see a whole range of system errors there. I think a lack of language understanding, a common language that they should have used in those systems was really crucial. I don't know, but I think it would be unusual for planes to take off with that less visibility now, because there was absolutely nothing they could do if something had gone wrong. I certainly know I've been at the airport when they've grounded planes for poor visibility, so I'm assuming that that's the case. So gradually we have learnt from those errors and put in prevention mechanisms, but certainly when we're thinking about developing new strategies, new innovations and so forth, that in terms of designing risk into those strategic decisions, we also ought to be thinking about how we design high reliability systems to prevent some of those accidents. And this is absolutely not standardisation of procedures. In some ways it's the antithesis of that. It's a recognition that things can go wrong and how to account for that, how to change the course of what people are doing to safer outcomes. So things like, for something that's really technically crucial, you might get two people to do the one job so that there's a constant monitoring of people's behaviour. But I think we also recognise from that scenario that there are systemic pressures that lead people to violate rules. They mentioned the pilot who was worried about going over his flying hours for the day. Those kind of, they seem like administrative nothings in the aftermath of a disaster, but if they're playing on people's mind, you know, oh, I need to get there quickly, or you know, I'm going to get in trouble if I take longer than I should. Those kind of pressures exist in all industries, and can lead people to act fast, to meet deadlines and make mistakes. And there are violations at each of 3 levels. As you can see, knowledge, even the most highly knowledgeable person, when they're giving attention to new problems, they might not necessarily properly assess risk. If they're doing something where there's conscious problem solving, they might focus on some things at the expense of others. You know, they apply perhaps the wrong knowledge to the things that they're thinking about. In terms of rules, aviation is a classic industry where there's a rule for just about everything, and many of the people in the industry are, you know, highly motivated to do the right thing. They've been well trained. It's not uncommon for, we did a lot of surveys of aircraft maintenance engineers a few years ago, and the average tenure was about 15-20 years. Like, these are seriously skilled people, but if they're doing something that's automatic, something they've done 100 times, they may perhaps apply the wrong rule, or they may ignore unusual signs because it's just never happened before, something like that. And then there are things that we do that we're, as you saw in the film, highly skilled, but they so much so that they become routine. And I think driving is probably the best example of that. I mean, how many people have had attention lapses when they're driving? Your phone might go, or you might be changing the music, or you might just, I don't want to scare you, but sometimes I come back into driving and I think, oh God, where have I been for a few seconds? You know, it's just, I think it's just automatic. And there's also, you know, very good drivers who can, in a stressful situation, somebody does something unexpected and they make the wrong decision in a rush. That's annoying. I don't know how to get that off. Anyway. So in terms of the systemic pressures that might lead to rule violations, sometimes in terms of routine violations, people do things because it's quicker, and that might be maybe a cost-cutting element or some kind of cutting corners. They might try and optimise the outcome, doing it in a certain way for a certain reason. There's discussion in the literature of the thrill seeker option, the person who perhaps wants to be the star at doing something and so does it really quickly. That can of course be linked to organisational pressures at work. Sometimes it's necessary or situational. You saw when the pilot on the plane taxiing along realised that the other plane was taking off. It certainly wasn't in the rules to just drive off to the side, but he did it because it was the only option in that time. And when you see Deepwater Horizon next week, you'll see a couple of moments in that film where they depart from procedures, but is absolutely the only option at the time. And exceptional times, so that never happened before, circumstances are unknown, and people then might violate the rules. James Reason's a psychologist, so he's interested in the psychological elements of error making. I more think about it in an organisational sense and look at organisational pressures, but I certainly realise that there are certain psychological types, if you like, who might respond more to risk-taking or less to risk-taking and so forth. And we can look at assessing behaviour through looking at a decision tree by violation. How did they get to that point where they violated? And the influence of administrative controls, why something in the process or a determination of the output might lead to some kind of violation, and the kind of training and socialisation people have in organisations that lead to certain decisions being made. Now, you might wonder why I'm talking about the Swiss cheese model. Has anyone heard of it, the Swiss cheese model? Someone brought it up at dinner the other day, someone not in this area at all, and I was really surprised. It made me think about how broad it's become in its applicability. Do people know what Swiss cheese looks like? It's a slice and it's got holes in it, and that's what those 4 squares are supposed to look like. And Reason's idea is that most of the time, if you slice Swiss cheese and then lay it out on a plate, the holes won't line up. And if a trajectory towards an accident is happening, it might go through one hole, but it will hit some cheese, and that will be a sort of safety mechanism. And so he's basically talking about an active failure that happens, but then there are latent failures that might not line up, and so the accident is prevented. If the holes do line up and the trajectory is not stopped, then it can lead to an accident. And this second one here, I think, explains it really well. It's also, I guess, about learning from latent failures as well as active ones, but also about seeing the various pressures that can lead to failures. Firstly, at the institutional level, that the regulatory environment might not be effective enough, that there might be incomplete procedures or recommendations for people in particular situations. Then at the organisational level, the classic one will be mixed messages about, and you'll see that in the film as well. They go on and on about how safety is important on a Deepwater Horizon, but there's also a lot of production pressures as well. And so you, what is a person in that organisation supposed to think? Am I supposed to be safe, or am I supposed to go quickly? Then there's a responsibility shifting. People who should be in the know and making the decisions, sometimes it's left to someone who's less skilled, and they think, oh, well, I've got to do something, I'll just do my best. And that all sorts of people can be inadequately trained, particularly when we look at the tendency towards multitasking and multi-skilling in organisations. Oh, you can do this, you know, you've been here a long time, you'll know what to do, without realising that there are a whole range of tacit skills that the person might not have that would help them to do that job. Then attention distractions, which happen in all sorts of industries. In particularly, he's talking about aircraft, so he talks about deferred maintenance. Again, I don't want to worry you, but quite often a manager who will want the plane to leave on time because it's in his interest for an on-time departure will say, oh, I'll get that next time round. You know, we don't need to repair that now, we can do it next time it's in the shop. And there might be aircrafts are designed like any other kind of technology, and sometimes the technology is not working in the optimal way that it could be. A part might be clumsy or something like that. So he will say that some of these elements form latent failures. So, for example, there was a crash in the Florida Everglades that was put down to a particular part. That part had been maintained in a MRO in Turkey some years before, and it had taken time for the problem to emerge and show. So it's not necessarily the immediate thing that happened then that causes the mistakes. But if those mixture of active and latent failures line up and the trajectory goes right through and finds a series of holes and come through those defence mechanisms, there can be an accident. And so Reason's whole approach to this is looking for ways to design systems to try and learn from failures, and to set up systems to prevent failures, and also to try and recognise when failures might happen. Don't know why the typing hasn't come. There it is. So one of the things that both Reason and Perot have focused on is the degree to which the way systems are designed and how complex they are. And they talk about systems being tightly and loosely coupled. So an example of a tight coupling would be when one action has to happen and the next action has to happen really quickly afterwards, and there's no time for mucking about. A loose one would be, oh, well, you know, I finished this part and I'll do the next rest tomorrow. You know, that's not a tight coupling. The ordered processes, linking parts, the degree of tightness of the sequentiality and how interdependent the parts and tasks are. If it's just a one-path performance, so you just do the job and it's not linked with anything else, that's loosely coupled. And the degree of organisational slack, what happens if something's not done on time. In terms of complexity, it's about the degree of interactions, where there are lots of interactions in the process, and how something is designed, whether it has lots of sections, divisions, whether there are differentiations between them, and the process for feedback. And the recognition that failures can cross those subsections at the meeting between them, and particularly when there's unfamiliar or unexpected sequence of events, things that aren't visible or comprehensible, the likelihood of failure becomes much more becomes much more common. And again, think of that. In the film next week, there are times when they get conflicting information from different tests that they do, and they're not sure which information is the reliable ones, and they basically choose to go with one rather than the other, and there's really not a lot of evidence of why they should have done that. But organisational pressures, I think, is one of the explanations. And so I've used the example of a nuclear plant there as an example of an organisation that's got very high interactions and very tightly coupled systems. Everything is sort of very interdependent and crucially linked, and if things aren't done right on time in a proper sequence, all sorts of bad things can happen. So when systems are tightly coupled and dependent, and they have a high level of complex interactions, some theorists will argue that they're almost inevitably going to fail. Others will argue that the failures can be managed, but that's contradicted by some theorists who say if an innovation that you're planning is so complex, so tightly coupled and so dangerous, then maybe it shouldn't be attempted. And I would certainly say that about nuclear energy. I think it's a classic example of something that should just be left alone. You know, if you can't guarantee the safety and so forth. So I think there are design issues that can be addressed, and certainly things can be made more safe, but all the time technology is increasing in its complexity, so system tightness and interaction density are really the foundations of what Perot would call a normal accident. He worked also on the 3 Mile Island disaster, and he said that the technology was so tightly coupled, there were very, very time-critical processes, non-variable sequences, so if you did something in the wrong way, it wouldn't help, it might make it worse, and very little slack. And he provides a chart where you can sort of place industries in these matrices and see which are the ones that are loosely coupled, tightly coupled, whether they're linear or complex interactions. So I won't go through all of them, but say if you're in a trade school, say you're a carpenter learning at a trade school and you make a mistake with a piece of wood, that's the end of it. It doesn't go on to something else and cause drama down the line. But if you're in, say, a chemical plant, then everything you do has sequential effects on the people who come after you and so forth. And if it's very tightly coupled, then there's no room for mistakes. And of course, mistakes do happen, as we know. I don't know why. Yeah, so normal accident systems, Perot says, are tightly coupled and complex interactions that are going to inevitably lead to failure. And in that we can look both at the design of the particular technology or organisation, but also the interactions between people, whether there's a lot of high-level interactions that have to happen between people, and quick decisions and so forth can also be a fundamental process that leads to disaster. It's also good to look at the degree to which some of these industries, especially ones with hazardous material, suffer institutional and interactional drift. And I see that in aircraft all the time, particularly in relation to regulation, which we're going to talk about in a little while, that quite often there's a push to move regulation or make it less limiting for operators, and then you have a big accident, and then suddenly there are all sort of actors in society that are pushing for tighter regulation and greater oversight of processes. So I think there is what I like to call a sort of lurch and slide, or slide and lurch, with some of these things. And I thought about it in terms of microfinance institutions, even, that they start with a mission to help poor people by providing loans to people who wouldn't normally get them, but sometimes their practices over time will change, and the original mission of the microfinance firm is lost, and so they drop some of their client selection standards. They start hard selling loans because they know to keep the business in afloat they have to get customers. They force loan renewal. They don't necessarily have great practices in relation to their clients, and they push untenable repayment strategies. So a whole range of the things that started out to be, we're going to be different from the standard banks, start to slip into their practices. I think it's worth noting too that Quinlan says that we learn a lot from the investigations of accidents when they happen, if they're done properly, and we can also learn that a lot of investigations are not done properly. He said that most of the technological and design and engineering faults that are found are usually known. They're failures that are known, and for some reason that they haven't been fixed or something like that. But it's the organisational complexity that arises from business, not really technological reasons, that is most telling in determining why a disaster has happened. And so it's more important to focus on those failures that focus on systems rather than individual breakdowns in a piece of equipment or something like that. So setting up systems for being able to detect warning signs. Quite often there are things that don't make sense and people push on regardless, rather than thinking, hang on, we should stop here, regardless of if we're seen as wasting time. Doing proper risk assessment, making sure that you know all the elements before you proceed, occupational health and safety management systems, and of course auditing practices, making sure that everything is checked before the decision is made to go on. And I thought I would use the Glenbrook rail disaster, which I put on your reading list. I think Hopkins's work in this area is really interesting. I think most of you are too young to remember the Glenbrook rail disaster, but Glenbrook's here in the mountains in Sydney, and a train was given the wrong signals and went onto a line where there was a goods train that was stationary, and I forget how many people were killed. No, I won't say because I can't remember, but yeah, people were killed, and it was a terrible disaster. And Hopkins looked at the organisational structures and processes that were happening around the time of disaster, and I don't think he would say it was inevitable to happen, but he said the writing was on the wall, really, and that had proper notice been taken of some of these elements, that it might have been presented. And the first thing that really strikes you about the disaster is how much privatisation of the rail lines had created unsafe systems. We talked about unsafe acts before. Some of these come from the systems that are set up. And it really shocked me to know that different companies controlled the rail track, the stations where the station masters worked, and the signalling was done by a different contractor. So there was a lot of organisational separation between the different groups. In order to manage this sort of complex situation, they didn't kind of they had a very systems approach to it. We just need to write rules for everything, and then everybody will obey the rules, and then everything will be okay. But the rule books were generally created by people in offices who didn't do the work, and so they didn't have a strong understanding of the pressures on the ground and the kind of things that the workers faced. A lot of the rule books were written in confusing language, and if you looked up one rule, it would say, oh, see subsection blah, blah, blah of another rule, so you'd be going backwards and forwards between trying to work it out. Sometimes multiple rules might apply to the same situation, so it was difficult to know which one. And some of the workers reported in the investigation that they even asked their trainers what to do when they were having workplace training, and the trainers didn't know. So how are they supposed to know as well? And also a classic one is that there were too many rules to get across. It's not possible for people to retain 57 rules that they might apply in any given situation. It's just information overload. A lot of the staff felt that the rules were there as a kind of a window dressing to, you know, if something went wrong, the managers could say, oh, well, we've got the rule book, and not think about how difficult it was for the workers to apply it. But the rules then allowed them to blame staff and rather than set up safe systems. So it was the appearance of a safe system. We've mapped everything that there is to do with this rail line. We've covered every contingency. It's all in the rule book, but actually not implementing something that was actually safe. Indeed, there were instances where drivers complained about unsafe practices. In particular, 2 drivers refused to drive a train they said was unsafe, and they were punished for doing that. So it was a real this is what happens to whistleblowers kind of lesson for those workers. There were occupational barriers to communication. I'm sure those of you who've worked in organisation where the people in one department don't like the people in the other department, have you had that? Yeah, I can see a few heads nodding. You know, there's always sort of stereotypes, oh, they don't work hard enough, or they're the princesses, or, you know, there's any number of stereotypes. Well, in this situation, the signallers and the drivers and the guards all didn't really have much time for each other, thought that the others didn't know how hard they had it and all that kind of thing. And so there wasn't any mechanisms for them sharing information, passing on their difficulties to each other and saying, oh, hey, when I do this, can you do this, and that will make my job easier, blah, blah, blah. That kind of getting together never happened. Instead, all they got from management was this thing: we have to be on time. We're getting lots of political pressure from commuters complaining to government that the trains are always late, and we've got to try and get up our game. And the only measure was not safety, because of course it on the surface looks very safe, no accident has happened, but when you get down to the nitty-gritty, the real problem was pressure to be on time. And I think that notion of on-time running, you'll see it again in the film. I think the responses that the management and staff had in that pressurised environment for getting things on time is the same as any production pressure that you would have in any kind of, oh, our delivery's late to the client, or we need to get this product out to market. You know, there's always pressures, and on-time pressures can lead to mistakes. Now, using reason, Hopkins comes up with 4 sets of practices that he argues makes up a safety culture, and something that all organisations should work to adopt in any kind of work that they do, because the advantages are worth the costs. And I'm not saying that this is cost-free. I think that any safe system that prevents risks from leading to disasters is going to cost. But then, of course, you've got to measure what's saved from not having the disaster happen. So I'm going to talk about 4 things: a reporting culture, encouraging people to raise problems and not punish them if they do; a just culture, so people feel like they're being treated fairly; a learning culture, so that people learn from mistakes and get to do things better; and a flexible culture, not always relying on the way things are done if there's a situation arises where that's patently not going to do the job. And he said that if you can encourage a culture of collective mindfulness about risk, then you've got the basis of being able to understand the things that might go wrong, get good feedback and so forth, in order to prevent failures in the future. So he argues that, firstly, an organisation should have a preoccupation with failure, always thinking about what might go wrong, and trying to really keep it in mind. Just because we've been successful in being safe so far doesn't mean that that's a fait accompli. Acting against complacency, and all sorts of people are complacent about what might happen, and looking at where something in aviation, this is a real thing, that aircraft maintenance engineers are pressured by law to report near misses, because in a near miss you can look at what led to that near miss and then try and prevent that. Looking at small failures, inconsistencies in procedures and so forth, and trying to plan for the future in order to avoid those things. And most importantly, making reporting not routine. It's not like fill out form 365, the blue part, and sign it at the bottom, and then hand it into a box that never gets read. It's about every complaint being analysed and seeing what can be done better. Reluctance to simplify, avoiding the temptation to data strip, that's taking the data out of its context and trying to draw neat conclusions, looking at it in all its complexity and trying to see a myriad number of things that might have contributed. Understanding the complexity and the context that's vital to prevent disaster requires resources in the people who have the skills to be able to analyse, the time to do it, and the resources at their disposal to be able to take the time they need to do what they need to do. And of course, if you're in a cost-cutting environment, the slack that organisations might have to provide those people and resources is often not there. And so I always think a cost-cutting environment is almost certainly going to be an unsafe environment. In terms of sensitivity to operations, Hopkins says that workers and managers need to know more broadly beyond their job what's happening in the whole system and train to detect unusual results. And it's why Quinlan's work is so important when he looks at subcontracting, because when a certain section of the work is contracted, the person is paid only to do that little bit, and they might not necessarily understand the complex system in which they're working. And so we've got all sorts of examples of where someone's completed the work that they've been contracted to do, but there's a massive failure in the technology somewhere else that it just hasn't been their job to address. And so it's important that work systems are set up that encourage people to interact, to talk about unusual events, to try and work out why things have happened, and that freedom to discuss openly and try and get things resolved. And lastly, a commitment to resilience and deference to expertise that deference to expertise is something that can cause problems. And in aviation, I was interviewing a HR manager at a certain large airline in Australia who said that they've developed a system because captains are seen as the gods of the plane, and sometimes a lowly person might want to be reporting something problematic, and they developed a code word. And the code word changed all the time. They'd just say it was lollipop or something, that if you said lollipop, that was a code to say, you have to listen to me, this is really serious. And, I know you're a big important dude, but something's happening in the galley that might put the plane at risk. And those kind of systems, I think, are really important to get people to think outside the box of their own responsibilities. Hopkins talks about a cooperative mindset when things go wrong, working collectively to address the immediate threat. You can get back to disagreements and debates later, but if there's an immediate threat, you need to work together. And focusing on getting the person who's best equipped and knowledgeable to fix the problem rather than the person who's in charge, because sometimes managers are very removed from the things that are done on the ground, and so find the person who's the most expert to deal with that problem rather than the person who is nominally the most senior. Okay, so I'm going to move on to regulation, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go a bit quickly. Regulation refers to a host of rules that are set generally by the state to govern human and organisational behaviour, and the processes through which we enact, educate and enforce those rules. In this way, we're talking about rules that are external to the organisation, and I think it's often very good for organisations to have those external rules, because if they're just thinking internally about what's good for the organisation, they can miss some of the more broad societal responsibilities that they have. So, for example, it might be cheap to pour your waste into a river, but an external regulation will say that's against the law, it's good for society if you don't pollute the crap out of the rivers. It's also to influence behaviour, and for that reason the state has regulatory techniques from command and control to more kind of persuasive methods, and we're certainly moving more towards the persuasive end of regulation in recent years. So, for example, in terms of minimum standards for pay, there are rules about what workers need to be paid. Norms are established externally for the low paid. There is the national wage case every year in Australia, which looks at the cost of living and what people are being paid and works out an increase. There's also monitoring the behaviour of those who are supposed to be regulated by these rules, getting research on the practices that they're adopting, and perhaps developing new rules if those rules aren't working, or better ways to encourage compliance. There's certainly information loops. In the national wage case, all sorts of groups can put in submissions to try and influence the Fair Work Commission about what they think the new wages should be. They're fairly standard reading. I think I could write the Retail Traders Award submission in my sleep because it says the same thing every time. But nevertheless, it's there for people to have feedback into the process. And there are mechanisms there to try and, where situations are important and the regulation really needs to be abided by, to look at acceptable limits of the regime, and when people go over those limits, to develop some enforcement action and oversight mechanisms. And where there's failures in the system, to develop new regulations, or to get tougher on recalcitrants. And I don't know if you've seen it recently, there's a new legislation, amendment to the Fair Work Act for protection of vulnerable workers, people who aren't able to protect themselves against underpayments in organisations. And it's been interesting to see the Fair Work Ombudsman, the regulator in this instance, go into organisations and really make sure they do the right thing. Now, there are a lot of external debates about the role of external regulation, social debates about whether we need all this, what they call third-party intervention or red tape around business activities. And there's a real push for what we call light touch regulation. Howe and Landau talk about it. I'll mention it later in the lecture. So about how much regulation is a good thing. But generally speaking, when you're talking about risk, I think you need to think about the risks of having light touch regulation, because I think the more you take off those societal expectations, the greater the risk might be. And then we talk about internal regulation, everything from mission, vision and value statements to all sorts of policies and rules about behaviour in organisations. Definitely it will have a relationship to external regulation. Some policies are in response to external regulation. We look at corporate governance as a way of setting those internal controls in organisations to try and make sure that the organisation runs in compliance with external legislation, and also for minimising risk. State regulation even sets some boundaries for internal controls. They state to organisations that they have to have reporting requirements, or set up policies for various things. This happens particularly in public institutions where taxpayers' funds fund operations. You'll find that they've got pressures externally to institute internal regulation, like bullying policies or gender equity policies and so forth. In the gender equity area, they try and use persuasion on organisations to do things about improving gender equity by having some pressures on organisations to do the right thing. So if organisations don't report on their gender equity and performance, could people not talk when I'm talking? Up, back. Stop talking. Yeah, so for organisations that don't obey the rules in that area, there's fairly light touch responses to not doing the right thing. An organisation who doesn't report on gender equity can be named in Parliament, and I've got a, you can go on to the web and download a list of the recalcitrant ones. Some companies are on the list every year, and they can also be prevented from getting government contracts for work if they don't have good gender equity policies. But for some firms, I think they would think they don't worry too much about those penalties. Now, in democratic societies, statutes are enacted by legislatures, and obviously voters can apply pressure, the degree to which is kind of debatable. And in less democratic societies, regimes, the process is a lot more opaque and top-down. Also in countries with, I guess you might call Westminster historical connections, in addition to laws, there is also the common law, or what we call judge-made decisions, and these are slowly evolving legal principles that emerge from court decisions and appeals that set precedents that are then used as the basis for cases thereafter. And they particularly look at administrative things like negligence, damages, and breach of contract. So then we have to think about, if we're going to have regulation, do we want it to be rules-based or principles-based? And I guess that comes down to what's effective, what can get people to do the right thing most commonly in most situations. Braithwaite argues that rules-based regulation is only effective if the action is simple and relatively stable over the time. You can predict it. If something's not stable, then you're constantly having to amend the rules. He said that principles-based regulation is better when there's changing conditions and you need to be adaptable, and particularly when it involves large economic interests. And I think we've seen the rise of those latter conditions in recent years. Principles-based legislation relies on principles to articulate the outcomes to be achieved by the regulated entities. Principles regulation avoids reliance on those kind of rule book processes. The rule book applied to all versus ability to develop guidelines based on principles like consistency, honesty, good faith, and so forth that you would want to put into companies' processes. In terms of laws and types of role and types of laws, they're very important for governing risk and controlling the behaviours of individuals and organisations. And for my own, I think the most effective ones are those that prescribe unacceptable behaviours and provide penalties. I think if you don't provide penalties, then people aren't going to take the rules seriously. Most laws are specific to countries of operation. They don't often go beyond state borders, but we are starting to see, particularly in the area of supply chains, impositions on local companies about where they get goods and under what conditions those goods are made. In practice, for any organisation of any size, there are a complex array of laws that are very difficult in some ways for managers to get across. When you think of environmental laws, public safety laws, transport laws, commercial laws, you know, how they have to deal in good faith, and even criminal laws to a certain extent. and a lot of companies will complain about them being quite restrictive on their and being complex, so requiring a lot of time to get across their obligations. But even organisations in many senses will have an interest in laws. Even if they don't like it for themselves, they want it to control their competition, because, you know, if, say, a renegade competitor is not paying decent wages to their staff, that creates an unfair advantage for those companies that aren't obeying by the law, unless, of course, they get caught. There are a lot of examples of industries where there are certain players who constantly push the envelope against regulation, and can it can then potentially force the adoption of harsher laws, which affects everyone in that industry. There are comparatively, I think, few criminal legislations that apply to the corporate sector. Most of what is done in corporations is often seen as an administrative violation, but there are changing views in some areas about that, obviously for the grossest financial malappropriation and so forth, but also things like industrial manslaughter. There are now several states that have much stronger regulations for managers who kill people. And so in organisations there is an overlap between civil law and criminal law. Criminal law is less likely to apply to organisational life, apart from in a few areas. I feel like I'm running out of time, so I might just have a look at in terms of some of the standards that laws set. There's a difference in approach in terms of whether we think the organisation or the person has absolute versus relative liability. Absolute liability is when there's absolutely no excuse for what the person did and that they should face the consequences. Relative liability is how reasonably practicable was it for the person to do the right thing in a particular instance, and that can sometimes take the consideration of organisational pressures and the combination of people having to work together. It's also similar in terms of professional organisations. Sometimes they will have punishments about, well, we authorise you to practice in this profession, and we can withdraw your ability to practice. So that can also apply to wrongdoing. Licensing is another way that you can ensure standards are met. Particularly, I think, having people who have an external authority for their licence means that you bring in outside standards to the organisation to oversee what the organisation is doing, because the onus is on the operator to make sure the organisation does the right thing or lose their licence. In terms of enforcement agencies, there are some obvious ones and some less obvious ones here. The courts and the judiciary, various parts of the state like police and customs. Then there are various agencies that overlook wrongdoing and assess the risk of organisations going down the paths they are. Things like the Government Audit Office and the I've forgotten what OIG stands for, Office of something or other government, I forget, in the US. In New South Wales, for example, we have ICAC, which looks at corporate wrongdoing. There are also a range of inspectorates, and these are really important for environmental protection, people looking at new projects and making sure that they're not damaging wetlands or something like that, food safety, transport safety, labour standards, all those kind of things. Investigators, like at the Australian Transport Safety Board or Enforcement Task Force, like the ATO, can all monitor the kind of activities that take place and look at the risks and appropriate punishments if corporate actors are doing the wrong thing. Then there are lots of corporate watchdogs like the ACCC, and there can be written into legislation the requirement that companies or organisations engage their own auditors. So, for example, at the moment, trade unions are expected to provide audited accounts to show that they're doing the right thing with members' money and so forth. That's currently under threat at the moment, that arrangement. There's a so-called integrity bill before Parliament that will give certain officers of Parliament the entitlement to intervene more strongly in union affairs. But the degree to which those groups can impose penalties for non-compliance, I think, is really important in terms of the degree to which their rules and regulations are taken seriously. I've gone over. Now, in terms of who's responsible, I think this is interesting for you to know. The duty holder is a phrase that's used particularly in workplace health and safety, but there are a number of people who have duties in the organisation beyond that and can be held accountable if they make mistakes. Particularly, liability is often focused on organisations, and they are most commonly seen as vicariously liable for the mistakes and misdeeds of people within the organisation. That doesn't mean that there isn't any individual responsibility. Employees and members of the public have a duty to behave responsibly and follow lawful instructions. So, for example, if a fire alarm goes off, then you're all supposed to go and meet outside and not stay in the building. People will have nominated roles which will have certain legal expectations, like a chief financial officer is obviously not supposed to run away with the cash and so forth, and there's lots of licensed operators like engineers and pilots, again, who have certain rules they need to follow. The responsibilities of boards of directors and chief operators are defined in legislation, and woe betide those who don't know those responsibilities, because they can end up in hot water. The PCBU is the phrase in the OH&S legislation. A person conducting a business or undertaking can be open to all sorts of fines if people are hurt at work, and mostly one of the things that protects them is to look at the responsibility they have to set up systems for ensuring legal compliance and safety, and if they can show that they have tried to do that, even if something bad happens, it is something of a protection at law. Now I'm going to skip through to the critical issues in regulating risk. I think risk-based regulation can include a whole basis of prescriptive standards and rules, and it's particularly important in high-hazard, high-risk industries. Often that regulation will mandate the reporting of incidents and events. Then there's a degree of regulatory oversight. How much is regulation enforced? Is it effective? Is it well monitored? Oversight can lead to a whole range of gaps in that enforcement and flaws in the legislation. I think it's often a problem with many of these regulatory bodies that they're not resourced enough, and so they've got a tiny inspectorate and 1,000,001 workplaces that they need to inspect, or they might spend their enforcement activities poorly targeting, so doing a range of inspections of relatively safe organisations and not focusing the limited resources they have on the ones that are really going to have some problems. There's the problem of regulatory capture. I'm not sure if you've heard that expression before. It's the notion of the regulator being too close to the industry that they're supposed to monitor. You might have heard in the Hayne Royal Commission into banking that he criticised ASIC for being too close to the bankers and not wanting to talk tough. That is worryingly true of CASA in a lot of ways, the civil aviation regulator, that they're too close to the operators and don't come down hard when they're having safety violations. And there are all sorts of problems with a couple of airlines that have since closed now, that people in the industry will say, look, those problems were known for years and they didn't do anything about grounding the planes until it was, very late in the piece. There's also the question of forum shopping, that people who get into trouble will seek court jurisdictions that are more likely to be sympathetic or receptive to their actions, and that can be the case for organisations that maybe do a wrong thing in a subsidiary overseas. They'll tend to come home for their court litigation, and they'll go to the forum that has the rules that are most conducive to their interests. And so there are different legal rules around, say, discovery, security for costs, appealability, rules for evidence and so forth. If they can find a regime that's more likely to give them a good finding, then they're likely to go to that. There's also the question of harmonisation. We live in a global world, and obviously many companies are not just in one nation, and they often have to work with their subsidiaries about the working through regulatory frameworks and standards in laws across a range of jurisdictions. Sometimes harmonisation can lead to a downward pressure. We need to have everything the same, so we'll have the lowest common denominator so that it's the same, rather than trying to ensure the highest of standards. And then there's the question of deregulation, the rise of neoliberalism. I'm not sure if you would have heard that phrase before. It's basically an assumption that competitive markets are the best dictator of social good in terms of productivity, well-being and so forth. It particularly became the rationale of many governments from the 1970s onwards. It has been associated with economic disaster, rising unemployment, the decline of unions, really pushing for flexible labour market policies that drive down working conditions, and a lot of free trade elements that tend to support the strong and punish the weak. But basically, I think neoliberalism is characterised by focusing on the benefits of the free market and deregulation of business activity. So winding back regulation, especially on business, or putting regulation on business as enemies. So those who are deregulators often will want stronger regulation on trade unions. They often will lobby, and business has very powerful lobbyists who can remove laws that are in their way and assist them to compete more effectively, but also change in character laws that are more contractualist, less focused on the rights of participants in contracts and so forth. In terms of self-regulation, there's been a real push from business lobbyists to say, look, we're the best guardians of our own activities, and we know what the issues are for our members, and we can determine their behaviour. It has long existed in some professions. The AMA regulates the behaviour of doctors and will remove the right to practice for doctors who flout the rules. It's often justified on the basis of expertise, like we're the best people who know what a good doctor looks like. But deregulation, I think, has been really embraced by governments as I think a removal of their responsibility in many ways, but the flaws in that I think have been really highlighted since the GFC, when we've seen a whole range of regulations in the banking industry that should have limited what happened in the GFC were ignored and frustrated. We've seen workplace disasters and other incidents happen because there's been inadequate regulation, and also the accountability of organisations for some of those things. And often the measures of which companies are doing the right thing and which are the successful ones are set by agencies that really don't have much credit. So standard rating agencies, so forth, their track record shows a real failure to detect organisations that were near default or financial disasters, and they didn't downgrade firms when they were clearly in trouble, but governments still relied on those rating agencies for their reports. And last, I guess, is the push towards voluntary codes of practice in some industries, looking at corporates being the best to determine what's their social responsibility. The efficacy here is mixed. I think some organisations want to have a good reputation and they see it as important to their strategy, and so they embrace some of those voluntary codes. Others, I think, think it's well, we'll think about CSR after we've made a mozza. In terms of light touch regulation, it's grown up with that focus on neoliberalism and a real, I think, a focus on managerialisation of law, that the best laws are the ones that help business to do well. Those approaches to regulation are really moving away from the sort of controlled regulation that really had strong penalties for wrongdoing. And I think we can only see risks emerging from that light touch, that if there's no penalty for taking risks seriously, then it's unlikely that businesses will respond. Light touch regulation relies much more on guidance. Many of the regulators now, instead of punishing organisations, will pull out information sheets about here's how you can do the right thing. And economic incentives and disincentives can work in some instances and others not so effective. There's a lot of reliance on individual complaint-based regimes, which puts fairly powerless people up against the might of large corporations when they've got an issue. The anti-discrimination regime is classic for that. People have been treated badly, but they find that they're really in a difficult situation if they want to get justice. So a lot of the disadvantages are that there are sort of weak persuasive powers in practice. It's difficult to talk companies into doing the right thing, open to manipulation and sometimes unintended consequences, particularly if people think that there's no punishment for wrongdoing. So when something bad happens, I think people think, why wasn't something done? You know, why wasn't there a greater control, and so forth. And in the same society that says that, we talked in the first lecture about how people have a greater expectation that they should be protected in our society. But when it comes to talking about regulation, I think it's a quite common narrative that people say, oh, there's too much regulation, too much red tape I think it's difficult to have both. I think it's, in one way, we need to think about the society we want to live in and look at the role that regulation has in providing some of that safety. But cost cutting can reduce its people's compliance. There's a lot of political opposition to attempts to bring in better and stronger regulations. In some areas there are routine violations, like the George Kalambaris underpayment of wages. He clearly knew what the award wage was and just decided not to pay it. And some organisations see penalties from regulation as just a cost of doing business. If we don't get caught, then we save the money. If we do get caught, then we'll just pay the fine and go on as we were. So ask that question of yourself, is there too much red tape when it comes to risk management? All right, done. Thank you. Now, did we resolve your question now? Do you want to ask some more? Hey. Are you enjoying reading about it?
I was just wondering what type of regulation will be effective in that case? I mean, what
type of regulation
will be able to mitigate? Because light touch regulation in the case of GFC was, I mean, it has its own pros and cons that it's not that effective.
Yeah.
The impact is very high, but the frequency is low, and we are there to control that risk. Will it be done with regulation?
Is the frequency low though? I think the lower the regulation goes, the more the frequency will increase.
What do you suggest for the regulation?
My attitude to assignments like this is that it's not really up to students to solve the problem. I'm not asking you to provide recommendations.
Because we can't take any decision or...
No. And that's why I don't ask for a report. I'd rather you write an essay and just highlight all the complexity. Yeah, you don't have to fix it.
Quantitatively, we can say something that we can do this and this, but not
if you think there are things the government should have done or the company should have done, then absolutely. Well, when I think of... hello? Sorry? Oh. Yeah, your contributions will be recorded. Yeah, so I think you can certainly point out failures and omissions and things they could have done better, but they were also set on a trajectory at that point that I think it's hard to think that's... Well, it's one of the things that you could talk about in risk management is the role of people who raise the alarm. You know, when you see the film, you'll see there are people there who say, this is not good, we shouldn't be doing this, but they get overrun by the inexorable push to get production going.
Thank you.
Yeah?
Yeah, so just kidding.
You should ask these questions in the tutorial and share them with yeah, because when we just have one-on-one conversations, no one else hears it, but if you have it in the class, everyone can hear it.
He's in next
You look really familiar. Have we met before?
Yes, we did last week.
Oh, not just last week, generally. Oh.
Is it?
I haven't taught you before? No. Sorry, you look familiar.
I'm in big idea? Any chance?
Sorry?
Have you been attending any big idea? Any chance?
No, I haven't. No.
No, I've been part of them. That's why.
Oh, okay. And is that good? Is it going well?
Yeah. But after it's my final year, so I'm focusing on my career as well.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
She's currently part of it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to talk about.
Yeah, oh, good. You can share ideas,
Yeah.
big ideas, yeah.
Thank
Okay,
you.
see you next week.
I want to know whether should I try whether they give me a better of support to work on my tutorial.
Is this CDU one?
Sorry?
Is this CDU?
Letter of support.
Yeah. Did you do both?
Okay.
Yeah, because then if I get, is it just needing extra time with assignments?
Yeah.
Yeah. Your tutor will need to know, so knowing not to penalise, and I need to know more generally if there's an issue.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to know whether I should just forward it to you and you will forward to the tools or
Yeah,
I
just
should
if
do
you
the
send it
work?
by email, just put us both in the email.
Okay,
That'd be good.
thank you.
Yeah, and let me know if there's any issues. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Mine.